The perfect white tee is different for everybody. And so in this video, I'm going to show you how to dupe your favorite or perfect tee.
I'll show you all the steps from copying your favorite tee, cutting out the fabric, what stitches to use on a home sewing machine, and how to finish details like hems and necklines so that you have a beautifully finished t-shirt that doesn't look homemade.
Welcome to Slow Living. My name is Esther and I try to sew stuff that supports a sustainable lifestyle. On my channel you'll find a bunch of mending, altering and flipping videos and a little bit of self-development and creative play in there as well. In this video I'm going to show you how to sew up the perfect white tee. It is the t-shirt that I'm wearing underneath my husband's dressing gown. If you are wondering why I'm in a dressing gown, I am wondering the same thing. The reason I'm jumping on is because my face is never done. I had a photo shoot. That's what I made this t-shirt for. There's a whole backstory, but I won't bore you with it now because we're just gonna get started on a few important points. Firstly, there is no such thing as perfect. It sounded like a good title, fell for the thumbnail, so here we are. But let's be real, the perfect white tee is different for everybody. For me in this instance, it was a cropped tee that was not see-through. I wanted to use up fabric from my stash. Voila, the perfect white tee for me right now. For you, it might be a boxy fit, slim fit, oversized fit. And so in this video, I'm going to show you how to dupe your favorite or perfect tee. Secondly, fabric. Fabric is such an important choice. And if you're trying to recreate your favorite perfect t-shirt, you will need to find fabric that is almost identical to the fabric of that t-shirt. For example, if the t-shirt you are trying to dupe is 100% cotton, very stretchy, feels really lightweight, you need to try and find a similar fabric to that. If you use a different fabric, even if the cut is exactly the same, if you use a different fabric, it will sit differently. It will feel different. It won't be the same tee. Obviously, it literally won't be the same tee. You know what I'm trying to say. I think that's all I wanted to stress.
We're going to need some stuff. First off, pins. Beware, they can cause holes if they're blunt, so make sure your pins are nice and sharp. We need fabric scissors to cut out our fabric. We need a measuring tape. We also need a water erasable marker, which if you don't have, do you have chalk? Otherwise, you can use a regular marker, but be very careful with it because obviously if you mark your fabric and it's not erasable, it's not going to come out. We need a sewing machine. You can use a regular home sewing machine. You don't need a fancy serger, just a domestic one that has the basic stitches. You will need matching thread to get the best result, and you will need a stretch sewing needle. This is essential. Yes, this will cost a little bit extra, but if you don't use a stretch sewing needle, your machine might have issues sewing with stretch fabric, and that will make the job a lot more frustrating. Also, you will puncture little holes into your fabric, which over time will become bigger holes. So you need stretch sewing needles. Head to your local store and ask for help if you don't know what they look like. You'll also need an iron because pressing your seams as you sew and pressing your finished garment makes a big difference to the quality of your finished tee. You also need the t-shirt that you're going to dupe. I'm using this one here and I'll show you how obviously my t-shirt turns out differently, but I'll show you exactly how to dupe it to be the same if that's what you're after. And of course we need our fabric. I already mentioned in the intro that if you're trying to dupe your t-shirt and get it looking exactly the same and feeling exactly the same, you're going to need a fabric that is super similar to the tee that you're duping. Duping. Ask your fabric store assistant. They will be so knowledgeable and super helpful if you're trying to match a fabric. On the flip side, I'm going to use this long sleeve tee to make a totally different tee. So if you have a t-shirt that is almost perfect, but you have some small changes you want to make to it, I can show you how to do that too. You can note down any changes that you would like to make. For example, I'm going to make mine less fitted, short sleeve, and cropped. So just a note that you can go either way. You can dupe your tee to be exactly the same, or you can make changes to get a new style that is perfect for you. If you're not making any changes, then it's just good to try it on to check that it fits exactly how you would like it to. I've done some sketches here so that you can have a look at the pieces that we need to make up our t-shirt. T-shirts have fronts, backs, and 2 sleeve pieces that look like this. All of these pieces need to be sewn together, obviously, to make our t-shirt. So around each piece, we have something called seam allowance, which is an extra bit of fabric so that we can sew the pieces together without altering the actual fit or the finished measurements of the garment. So for example, I'm going to be doing 1 centimeter extra around every single one of my pieces. So we're calling that 1 centimeter of seam allowance. For the hem of the t-shirt and the hem of both sleeves, we need a little bit extra. I think the industry standard is around 1 inch, so around 2.5 to 3 centimeters. That's how much extra fabric we need just along the hems. I've shown that here in pink. So when it comes to tracing around our pieces, we need to take extra care that we leave this extra bit of allowance. Otherwise, when we sew these pieces together, you're losing a lot of fabric and your t-shirt will come out smaller than what you anticipated. I'll talk you through in more detail as we go, but I think it's really important for you to know this before we start. Another really important thing is how you lay out your fabric before we even start cutting or tracing anything. I'll show you using this striped fabric so that hopefully it makes sense. The stretch of this fabric is going in the same direction as these stripes. You can see if I pull it out this way, there is a lot of stretch, whereas if I pull it this way, there isn't as much stretch. This is the way that the fabric needs to go around my body so that I can get the t-shirt on and off. If you cut it the other way, or if you cut it on a diagonal, your t-shirt is going to come out so wonky and so strange, you'll wonder what went wrong. I hope that that makes sense. Alright, we're finally ready to start tracing off some pieces. The first piece we're going to start with is the back piece of your t-shirt. I'm going to lay my fabric down and then I'm going to lay my top on top of that. Make sure that it's aligned with the direction of stretch going around your body, and we want our t-shirt on top to be sitting nice and flat so that we can trace it off as accurately as possible. Pay close attention to where the seam lines of the t-shirt are. The seams look like this, where the pieces have been sewn together and there's somewhat of a line in your top. To accurately trace off the armhole or the arm side seams, I've popped my sleeves up on top of the back piece because I want them to be out of the way. I only need to access the armhole, otherwise known as the arm side, so get your sleeves out of the way. We don't need to trace them off until later. You can also refer to my sketch to see what your back piece should roughly be looking like. It's up to you if you want to trace precisely where your seams are, but make sure that you leave enough for the seam allowance to either add that on later on, or you can add it on now as you're tracing. I'm going to add mine on now, so I'm tracing 1 centimeter out from around the shape of my back piece, and I'm also adding the extra 2.5 centimeters to the hem. If you would like to change the length of your t-shirt like I am, I'm making my t-shirt more cropped, then now's the time to do that by drawing a straight line across the point you want your t-shirt to end. Don't forget to add your seam allowance to the bottom of your hem. If you would like to change your t-shirt to be tighter or looser, now is the time to do it when you're doing the side seams of the t-shirt, which is where I'm tracing now. T-shirts can have all different finishes around the neckline, which we often call binding or ribbing, and they can be all different measurements. In manufacturing, they use really specialized machines to do these finishes. So to standardize this tutorial, we're all going to finish the neck the same way, like this, which we can do with our regular home sewing machine. So in order to do that, when it comes to tracing your neckline, include the binding or any ribbing that looks like this into your front and back pieces. You should also be including seam allowance in addition to the neck binding. So for example, I'm tracing my front and back pieces, including this little bit of binding here, and I'm adding my 1 centimeter of seam allowance in addition to that. Once you're happy with the shape of your back piece, you can cut it out. It is important that your back piece is symmetrical, and it is likely that it's not going to be 100% symmetrical since we traced it off a t-shirt. So I've cut mine out, I'm going to fold it in half, and then I'm going to trim off and make small adjustments so that the back piece is symmetrical. Once I'm happy with my back piece, I'm actually going to use that back piece to trace off my front piece. The front and back pieces should be almost identical in shape except for the neckline. So I'm going to cut out a second back piece, and then I'm just going to change the neckline to turn it into my front piece. The curve of the front neck is usually lower than the back neck. And if you wanted to make any adjustments to your neckline, now is the time to do it. You could scoop the neck a bit lower, or you could make the neckline higher, depending on what your perfect tee idea is. Once you have your front and back pieces traced off, we're going to do a little adjustment in preparation for attaching our neck binding later on. The neck binding technique that I'll be showing you is going to add 2 centimeters extra to the neck. So to avoid getting a really high neckline once our tee is sewn up, we're going to trim away 2 centimeters now before we start sewing. Now we need to create the piece of binding that's going to be attached to the neck. In this footage, I'm measuring my existing tee, but what I want you to do is measure the neckline of your new t-shirt. So measure the front neck and the back neck and add those measurements together. Again, measure your new tee, not your old one. Note down your measurement, and now we can draft our neck binding piece. Our neck binding piece is actually just a rectangle shape. The long edge is our neck measurement, for me, 56 centimeters, and our short edge is 5 centimeters. If you're interested, the math behind it is this. The finished binding width will be 2 centimeters, and I'm adding half a centimeter for seam allowance. That makes 2.5 centimeters. The binding will actually be folded over for a nice clean edge when we attach it, which means we have to double these measurements to get the full width, which makes it 5 centimeters. Make sure the long edge of your binding is going in the direction of the stretch of your fabric. We need this binding to be nice and stretchy to ease into our neckline. I would probably recommend drawing your rectangle shape onto your fabric and then cutting it out, but I tend to be a little bit loosey-goosey. Now that we have front and back pieces and our neck binding piece, we're going to do the sleeves. People find sleeves tricky, but they're very simple. Easy for me to say, I know. If we have a look at the sketch that I've got here, this is the rough shape of a sleeve. Because a t-shirt sleeve is basically symmetrical, we can actually trace it off while it's folded. This means that our fabric also has to be folded. So make sure that your fabric is folded accurately, taking into consideration the direction of the stretch of your fabric, and then line up that fold with the fold of your t-shirt. You'll find you'll have to move the rest of the t-shirt out of the way like this in order to see the sleeve seam and in order to trace off the shape of the sleeve as accurately as possible. If you are wanting to alter the length of your sleeve, like I am, then now's the time to take your measurements from before and to apply that to your sleeve. So for example, I'm taking the measurement here from the top of my shoulder down to where I want my new sleeve to finish, and I'm going to lay that onto the pattern piece that I'm tracing, putting my measuring tape at the top of the shoulder point, and then measuring off and drawing a straight line across from where I want it to end. Don't forget your 1 centimeter of seam allowance around the entire sleeve, plus the sleeve hem should have a seam allowance of 2.5 to 3 centimeters. You can cut out your first sleeve and use that to trace off a second sleeve. Phew, that is all the prep work done. Now we're ready to get into some sewing. Since we are sewing with a stretchy fabric, we need our stitches to also stretch. So we cannot just use a normal straight stitch. You have to use either a lightning stitch like this or a zigzag. Your machine might have different symbols instead of numbers like mine has here, but basically on the left, the 1.0 is my stitch width, and on the right, the 3.0 is my stitch length. Those are the settings for a lightning stitch. If you're able to adjust your settings to that, then you should be able to sew a lightning stitch. You can check your sewing machine manual, and there might be suggestions for the best settings to use for stretch fabrics, and you can have a play with that. They might suggest some more complex stitches, but I highly recommend sticking to either a zigzag or a lightning stitch to keep things simple. This is what the lightning stitch should look like, and it means that when we wear our garment and stretch the fabric, the stitches are not going to break. Here I'm pulling apart the fabric quite hard so you can see the stitches, and I've also used a white thread so it's very obvious. If your thread is matching your fabric, you shouldn't really be able to see these stitches at all. If you don't have a lightning stitch setting, you can try this zigzag stitch. So these are the settings that my machine recommended. The stitch width is 0.8 and the stitch length is 2.2. This should come out looking like a very flat, tiny zigzag. A quick note about my t-shirt. I mentioned that my perfect t-shirt needed to not be see-through. So I have chosen to actually do double layered fronts and double layered backs. That means I have 2 layers of fabric for my front and 2 layers of fabric for my back. So if you notice that throughout the video, don't stress out that you don't have 2 layers. You should only have 1 front and 1 back if you're just sewing a regular t-shirt. Phew! We are ready to sew our first seam. We're going to place our front and back pieces right sides of the fabric together, lining up these shoulder seams here because we're going to sew straight across those first. A reminder that our seam allowance here is 1 centimeter. A lot of sewing machines have a little guide for you to line up the edge of your fabric. That means we should be sewing our stitch 1 centimeter in from the edge of our fabric. Once you have sewn the 2 shoulder seams, you should be able to open up your garment so that it looks like this. Now's the part where you should do as I say and not as I do, because I didn't press my seams. You should really press or iron your seams after you sew them. It really does make a difference for your finished garment, so I would encourage you to use your iron and press that seam so that it's nice and flat. It's up to you if you want to open the seam allowance or if you want to press it all towards the front or all towards the back. Okay, with the right side of your t-shirt facing up like this, we're going to attach our sleeve into this curve here, which is our armhole, or otherwise called an arm side. Find the midpoint of your sleeve and pin that right sides together with the shoulder seam that we just sewed. Next, I find it easiest to align the edge of the sleeve with the edge of the arm side on both sides, pinning those together before matching up the rest of the seam. Try not to overthink the shapes here. As long as you've pinned the pieces right sides together, you should be on the right track. I've shown you another view that better shows the shape of our sleeve when it's not all bunched up. We're going to sew along that seam, again 1 centimeters seam allowance, and once you've nailed one sleeve, you can attach the other one as well. Once you've sewn those seams, pop the right sides together, so you should be able to see all the seam allowance and the messiness on the outside now. And we're going to line up the front and back pieces all the way up the sides, all the way down to the sleeve hem. We should match up the arm side seams of the front and the back pieces so that all of that seam allowance is lined up in the same spot, and you can either push it towards the body or push it towards the sleeve. Sew down those side seams all the way from the sleeve hem down to the t-shirt hem, and your t-shirt should really be starting to look like a t-shirt. You can give it a little try to make sure that you're on the right track. Let's do the neck binding next. Take your rectangle and pop it right sides together, so fold it in half, and we're going to sew 1 centimeter down that short edge. Once it's sewn, open up the seam allowance nice and flat so that it looks like this, and then we're going to fold it in half long ways so that it looks like this. Use your iron and press it down nice and flat. You can use pins to hold that fold in place, and we're going to divide the neck binding piece into 4 equal parts. So you can either measure it and mark out your measurements. Otherwise, I like to be a little bit loosey-goosey and estimate where the halfway points are, pop a pin in, find the next halfway point, and so on until you basically have 4 equal sections of your neck binding piece. Now we're going to grab our t-shirt and make sure that it's inside out. All of your seam allowance and the messy stuff should be on the outside where we can see it. Now we're going to divide our neckline into 4 equal sections. Again, you can measure it if you find that easiest. Otherwise, I kind of like to estimate and see where the front of the garment is, the back. You get the gist. 4 equal sections. Now we can find that seam in our neck binding, the bit that we sewed before, and we're going to match that up with the back of the neck. I think in industry they put it at the back left of the neck. They don't put it directly at the center back, but for the ease of this tutorial and for matching up our neck binding with our neckline, we're going to put it at the center back. This means we should be able to match up the 4 equal sections that we made in our neck binding piece to the 4 equal sections that we made in our neck. Since our t-shirt is inside out, our binding should be sitting on the inside of our t-shirt. The raw edges of your binding piece should be lined up with the raw edge of your neck. Have a look at your machine and see if this part of your machine can come out like mine. It will make getting your neckline under the machine a bit easier so that we can sew 1 centimeter from that edge. If you're on the ball, you'll pick up on the fact that I only allowed for 1/2 centimeter of seam allowance for attaching this neck binding. If you are adamant on having a 2 centimeter finished width of binding, then only sew 1/2 centimeter of seam allowance all around the neckline. If, like me, you don't mind having a slightly less than 2 centimeter finished width of binding, then you can sew with a seam allowance of 1 centimeter. I recommend sewing with 1 centimeter of seam allowance instead of 1/2 because the fabric is less likely to get caught against the edge and it prevents the presser foot from becoming uneven and tricky to navigate for beginners. If you didn't catch anything that I just said, ignore it and let's just sew with 1 centimeter of seam allowance all around the neck to attach the binding piece. Once it's attached, it should look like this, and we can move on to hemming. Remember that our hem seam allowance is 2.5 to 3 centimeters or an inch, so we have a little bit more fabric to play with here. To finish our hem, we're simply going to fold up the raw edge to the inside of your t-shirt and we'll sew it down flat. To avoid a wonky hem, use a measuring tape and turn the edge of the hem up 2.5 to 3 centimeters, pinning each section as you go until you've pinned the entire hem. Do the same for your sleeve hems, working bit by bit until you've gone all the way around. Once you've pinned all around, use an iron to press it flat, which will make sewing it down a lot easier and more accurate. While we're here at the iron, we might as well press our neckline as well, the seam that we sewed before. Press it down nice and flat to get a really nice neck binding finish. Before we sew our hems, we're going to make our zigzag stitch setting a bit wider, so I'm increasing the stitch width to 2.2. If you were using the lightning stitch before, you'll need to switch to a zigzag stitch now. This is what the 2.2 stitch width and 2.2 stitch length looked like. After doing the sample, I preferred an even wider zigzag, so I increased the stitch width a bit more to 2.8. When we sew our hem, we should be sewing from the right side of our t-shirt. You can't see my seam allowance. It's hidden underneath and I'm sewing on top of it. This can make it a little bit tricky, but you can use the guidelines on your sewing machine to line up your hem. And if you don't have guidelines, you can use something removable like sticky tape to create your own guideline to make sewing straight easier. Our seam allowance is 2.5 to 3 centimeters, so you don't want to sew too close to the edge of that because you don't want to miss any of that seam allowance, which might cause the hem to come undone. Go nice and slow when you're doing your hems. I know that it's really tempting to go faster on a sewing machine and to stretch out the fabric, but you really don't want to stretch it because your hem will look like it's stretched out. Just go nice and slowly and let the machine feed your fabric through as you sew. That's the last step to completing your t-shirt. Don't forget to give it a really good press. Press all of the seams, especially the hem. Get it nice and flat, and then our t-shirt is complete. Thank you so much for watching. I didn't realize that this would become such a lengthy video, but there were so many little things that I felt like I had to include if you wanted to get a good result in the end. I know that if you're a beginner sewer, there are lots of things that are assumed in the sewing world and you miss little bits of knowledge like about grain lines or how to cut your fabric. So I tried to be really thorough. Let me know what you thought, and if there was anything that I missed, you can pop any questions that you had in the comments and I'll try to help you out. If you enjoyed this video, I do have a bunch of other videos all about sewing a sustainable wardrobe. I've done some mending videos, altering videos, so head over to my channel and you'll find those there. I think my little one is waking up, so I need to wrap this up. I'll just voice over any other parts that I missed. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in another video soon. Bye. Oh, I need my mic. I think we're just gonna film this without a mic. Okay, quick backstory. I was kind of killing two birds with one stone with this t-shirt. In Australia, we're about to go into summer. We are the opposite to most of the world. Our Christmas is hot. Unfortunately, white t-shirts are one of those items that have a pretty short life. They kind of need to be fresh. So
I really needed a new white t-shirt. I also had a family photo shoot coming up. It involves my extended family, which means we all had to kind of coordinate what we were wearing so that colors didn't clash. Our memo was very, very original. White, beige, a little bit of light blue. So it was the perfect opportunity for me to sew up this white t-shirt for this occasion, get so much wear out of it for the coming seasons and hopefully the coming years as well. It was also the perfect opportunity to film this video for you because I think it will be really helpful. I don't know why my jeans are in the background other than I'm wearing pajama pants on the bottom. I should have just taken off. Oh no, it's white on white. Anyway, I also got my hair done. Perfect opportunity to film and not have to get made up again.